The air in the clandestine test cell at the Power Jets research facility in Lutterworth, Leicestershire, was thick with an acrid cocktail of scents that would one day become synonymous with the new age of flight: the sharp tang of burnt kerosene, the heavy odor of hot metal, and the faint, sweet smell of high-grade lubricating oil. It was 1944, and while the skies over Europe were still dominated by the thunderous roar of piston engines and the rattle of machine guns, a small group of men in this unassuming, cramped workshop were bending the very laws of physics to their will. They were testing a machine that was not merely an improvement on existing technology, but a complete reinvention of it. A machine that felt, in its sleek, brutal efficiency, like it had fallen through a crack in time from the next century. This was the Rolls-Royce Nene, one of Britain's first truly production-quality centrifugal flow jet engines. It was a masterpiece of mechanical elegance and raw power. Compared to the complex, thousand-part symphonies of pistons, crankshafts, and camshafts that powered Spitfires and Lancasters, the Nene was a study in beautiful simplicity. Its core was a single, rotating assembly, a massive, forged impeller that sucked in vast quantities of air, a set of diffusers that slowed and compressed it, and a combustion chamber where fuel was injected and ignited, creating a continuous, roaring inferno that blasted out of a turbine and nozzle to produce thrust. It was compact, a dense cylinder of power that could be slung under a wing or nestled in a fuselage with relative ease. And it was brutally powerful, delivering over 5,000 pounds of thrust, a figure that made even the most powerful piston engines, with their complex systems of propellers and gearboxes, seem archaic. But its most revolutionary quality was its efficiency. Unlike the pulse jet of the V-1 flying bomb, which was a crude, shuddering pipe, or the early axial flow jets of Germany that were complex and temperamental, the Nene was remarkably refined and reliable. Its centrifugal design, championed by the brilliant and often acerbic Frank Whittle, was inherently robust. It could run for hundreds of hours, its thrust smooth and constant, a relentless push rather than the frantic, pounding pulses of a piston engine. It promised a future of aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and farther, leaving the world of propellers and machine gun interrupter gears behind for good. To the men of the British Air Ministry, the Nene was more than just a new piece of hardware. It was a symbol of national resurgence and future security. In the twilight of the war, they could see the dawn of the next conflict, and they were determined that Britain would not be left behind. The Nene was their ticket to a new era of air superiority, a technological leap that would keep them at the forefront of global power. But in the halls of the Kremlin, viewed through the lens of Soviet intelligence reports, the Nene was something else entirely. To the USSR, a nation whose aviation industry had been built on licensed production, espionage, and rugged, simple designs, the British jet was a miracle. A miracle they desperately needed, and one they were fully prepared to steal. Their own early jet efforts, like the MiG-9, were hobbled by primitive, reverse-engineered German engines that were unreliable and underpowered. The Nene represented a quantum leap, a fully matured technology that could, almost overnight, close the gap with the West. It was a prize of incalculable value, and Stalin's long arm was already reaching for it. The winter of 1946 was one of the coldest on record in Europe, a deep freeze that seemed a physical manifestation of the new political climate settling over the continent. The Grand Alliance that had defeated Nazism was crumbling, its foundations turning to ice. In London, diplomats at the Foreign Office, their breath misting in poorly heated rooms, huddled over dispatches that told a grim story of Soviet intransigence and expansion. The Iron Curtain, as Churchill had famously declared just months before in Fulton, Missouri, had fallen. It was in this deepening chill that a diplomatic cable from Moscow arrived. It was, on the surface, a model of bureaucratic politeness. It praised the wartime cooperation between the Allied powers. It expressed a fervent desire for continued peace and friendship. And then, almost as a postscript, it made a request. The Soviet Union, in the spirit of technological collaboration and mutual advancement, was interested in acquiring examples of the latest British jet engine technology. Not the theoretical plans, not the blueprints. They wanted the actual, physical engines. The fully functioning machines. The men who read the cable could scarcely believe their eyes. It was an audacity that took the breath away. They had just spent 6 years fighting a war in which the Soviet Union had been a vital, if often difficult, ally. Now, that same ally was forcibly installing puppet regimes across Eastern Europe, blockading Berlin, and engaging in a global game of ideological brinkmanship. And they were asking, with a straight face, for the single most advanced piece of military technology in the British arsenal. It was not a request, it was a demand, clothed in the thin veneer of diplomacy. It felt, to every official who read it, strangely like a threat, a test of Western resolve. Debates raged within the British government. The Air Ministry and the military were apoplectic. To hand over the Nene was tantamount to unilateral disarmament. It would gift the Soviets 5 years of jet engine development in a single crate. They argued, passionately, that it was an act of national suicide. But the political wing, led by Prime Minister Clement Attlee's government, saw a different calculus. The war had bankrupted Britain. The nation was exhausted, its cities in ruins, its empire fraying. A new, open confrontation with the Soviet Union was a terrifying prospect. Perhaps, the thinking went, this gesture of goodwill could ease tensions. Perhaps it could buy time. Perhaps it was a way to demonstrate British confidence, that even with the technology, the Soviets could never truly catch up. It was a dangerous gamble, a policy born of equal parts hope and desperation. Incredibly, unbelievably, after weeks of agonized deliberation at the highest levels of government, Britain said yes. The decision sent a shockwave through the intelligence and military communities. It was seen as an act of unparalleled folly. Packed into crates, accompanied by a handful of technical manuals and a sense of profound misgiving, several Rolls-Royce Nene engines began their journey east, to the heart of the nascent Soviet Empire. They were traveling into the hands of a future enemy, a gift wrapped in the naive hope of peace, destined to become the heart of 1,000 Soviet fighters that would soon be pointed back at the West. The British had handed Stalin the keys to the jet age, and all they could do was pray it was a lock he could not pick. The decision, when it finally came from the highest levels of Clement Attlee's government, was not made in a vacuum. It was born in the shadow of a war that had left Britain physically shattered and financially prostrate. The nation was exhausted, its cities still scarred by bomb craters, its people surviving on rations that would continue for years. The treasury was empty, the empire was fracturing, and the specter of a new, even more terrifying conflict with the Soviet Union, a nation with a massive, battle-hardened army, was a nightmare that haunted Whitehall. The memory of the Blitz, of V-2 rockets, of the sheer, industrial slaughter of the past 6 years, was a fresh wound. The prevailing sentiment, a desperate, almost pathetic hope, was that any spark of confrontation must be extinguished, at almost any cost. And so, the unthinkable was approved. The transfer of 25 fully assembled, crated, and ready-to-run Rolls-Royce Nene turbojet engines was given the official green light. They were classified as civilian technology, a legal fiction that fooled no one but provided a thin veneer of diplomatic cover. Packed in custom-made wooden crates, cushioned against the long journey, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Soviet Union. It was a technological treasure trove, a gift of incalculable strategic value, handed freely to a regime that was already being identified as the next great threat. Across the political and military spectrum, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief and fury. Senior engineers at Rolls-Royce, men who had poured their genius and sweat into the Nene, felt a profound sense of betrayal. Scientists working on the next generation of jets saw it as the willful surrender of their lead. And Winston Churchill, now leader of the opposition, thundered in Parliament, his voice a roll of prophetic condemnation. He would later call it, with the brutal clarity of hindsight, the single most naive, foolish, and catastrophic decision of the post-war decade. He saw it not as an act of peace, but of appeasement, a failure of nerve that would only embolden the Soviet bear. But in 1946, shrouded in the rhetoric of maintaining peace and fostering international cooperation, the deed was done. The ships sailed east. In the Soviet Union, the arrival of the engines was met with triumphant euphoria. This was not just a procurement success, it was a colossal intelligence coup, achieved without a single spy having to risk their life. The crates were unloaded at a secure facility outside Moscow, their lids pried open with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics. Propaganda photographers were ushered in to capture the moment, serious-faced Soviet engineers gazing upon the sleek, powerful forms of the Nene, symbols of capitalist technological achievement now in the hands of the socialist state. The message was clear, the future belonged to the USSR. For the Soviet leadership, it was a moment of supreme validation. With these British engines, they could leapfrog a decade of painstaking, expensive research and development. They could power a new generation of interceptors that would dominate the skies, neutralizing the American B-29s and the nascent British jet fleet. It was a shortcut to parity, a magic bullet. But then came the fundamental miscalculation, the fatal flaw in the Soviet plan. They didn't just want to use the engines, to bolt them into airframes and call it a day. That would have made them dependent on a trickle of foreign technology, a position anathema to the Soviet doctrine of autarky. No, they wanted to become Rolls-Royce. They wanted to copy the engines down to the last bolt, the last thread, the last microscopic machining mark. They wanted to build thousands of them, to master the process, to claim the technology as their own. The Nene was not just a power plant, it was a textbook, and they were determined to memorize every page. And that is precisely when the embarrassment began. The task was given to the Klimov Design Bureau, one of the Soviet Union's premier engine houses. Their chief, Vladimir Klimov, assembled his best team, metallurgists, aerodynamicists, machinists, in a secure, brightly lit hangar where the disassembled Nene engines lay on long tables, their components arranged with surgical precision. The air was thick with anticipation and the smell of high-grade British lubricant. To these men, this was the ultimate challenge, a puzzle box of Western genius that they were destined to solve. The initial eagerness lasted about as long as it took to remove the first turbine blade. Almost immediately, they hit a wall, not of policy or politics, but of pure, unadulterated physics and material science. The metallurgy was wrong. The Soviet engineers, masters of making robust, simple steels that could perform under brutal conditions, were baffled by the alloys in the Nene. The composition of the high-temperature nickel-chromium superalloys used in the turbine blades was a mystery. Their own attempts to produce an equivalent resulted in metals that were either too brittle, too soft, or unable to withstand the relentless, searing heat of the combustion chamber. The machining tolerances were impossibly tight. The impeller, the very heart of the centrifugal compressor, was a single, forged masterpiece of aluminum, its blades curved with an aerodynamic elegance that seemed to defy manufacture. Soviet machine tools, hardened by years of producing rugged tank parts and artillery shells, simply could not replicate the fine, precise cuts. Their copies were rougher, less balanced, introducing vibrations that would prove fatal at high rotational speeds. And then there were the turbine blades themselves. To the Soviet engineers, they seemed almost supernatural. They were not just metal, they were a carefully crafted composite, able to sit in a stream of incandescent gas and not only survive but retain their strength. Their internal cooling passages, a labyrinthine network that allowed a film of cooler air to protect the metal, were a work of art that their own casting technology could not hope to replicate. Every attempt to build a copy, designated the RD-45, ended in the same, fiery disaster. On the test stands, the Soviet engines would roar to life, a promising, thunderous sound. For a few minutes, they would perform. Then, as temperatures climbed, the weaknesses would reveal themselves. The turbines, made of inferior alloys, would begin to warp, the delicate airfoils distorting under the heat and centrifugal force. Then, blades would snap. A single failure would be catastrophic, as the liberated piece of red-hot metal would ricochet through the engine, shredding other blades, destroying the compressor, and turning the entire assembly into a contained explosion. Sealants, designed to withstand the intense heat, would bubble, melt, and drip out like candle wax, causing oil leaks and pressure losses. They tried everything. They experimented with different steel compositions, adding rare elements in desperate, unscientific combinations. They tried increasing airflow to cool the engines, which only disrupted the carefully balanced combustion process. They tried redesigning the cooling ducts, but without the foundational understanding of the fluid dynamics involved, their modifications were like a child doodling on a blueprint. The contrast was humiliating. The British Nene was a masterpiece of integrated design, where every component, from the bulkhead bolts to the turbine blade coatings, was part of a coherent, optimized whole. It was more than the sum of its parts, it was a symphony. The Soviet RD-45 was a cacophony. It was a collection of parts that looked, on the surface, like a Nene, but lacked its soul, the deep, foundational knowledge of materials science, precision engineering, and systemic integration. The British engine was a thoroughbred racehorse. The Soviet copy was a donkey dressed in racing silks. It was a catastrophe that exposed not a lack of ingenuity, but a profound gap in the entire industrial and scientific ecosystem of the Soviet state. They could take the engine apart, but they couldn't understand its heart. The atmosphere in the concrete block test cell at the Klimov Bureau was thick with a desperate, sweat-scented tension. It was a chamber designed to contain catastrophe, its walls reinforced with steel plate, its observation booth shielded by thick, leaded glass. For months, this room had been a theater of disappointment, echoing with the coughs and sputters of failed prototypes, the acrid smell of burnt fuel and seared metal clinging to every surface. But today was different. After countless revisions, after frantic consultations with metallurgists and frantic remachinings of components, the team believed they had finally triumphed. They had built an engine, the RD-45, that looked perfect. It was a mirror image of the Nene, a twin born of sheer, dogged persistence. The engine was bolted securely to the massive, hydraulic test stand, a captive beast ready for its trial. Fuel lines, thick and rubberized, were connected. Electrical umbilicals snaked away to monitoring stations. A team of technicians in stained overalls performed the final checks, their movements crisp, their faces masks of professional focus that barely concealed a deep-seated anxiety. In the observation booth, a nervous KGB officer, his presence a reminder of the project's immense political importance, stood with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Vladimir Klimov himself was there, his eyes fixed on the engine, his career, and perhaps his freedom, resting on the performance of this machine. A final nod. A technician threw a switch. The electric starter engaged with a high-pitched whine, spinning the engine's core. Then, the ignition sequence began. A puff of smoke, a low rumble that quickly built into a deafening, thunderous roar. For 5 glorious, heart-stopping seconds, it looked promising. The engine held. The noise was immense, powerful, a physical force pounding against the concrete walls. A few of the engineers allowed themselves a glance, a flicker of hope in their eyes. They had done it. They had tamed the British beast. Then came the scream. It was a sound that was not of combustion, but of destruction. A piercing, metallic shriek that cut through the roar, the sound of metal being tortured, stretched beyond its limits, and torn apart from the inside out. It was the sound of a spinning turbine disc, unbalanced and overstressed, as it began to disintegrate. There was no time to react, no time to shut it down. The engine exploded. It was not a fireball, but a contained, directional fury. The casing, made of Soviet steel that was not quite up to the task, split open like a rotten fruit. Shrapnel, chunks of compressor blades, fragments of turbine discs, pieces of housing, was launched outward with the force of a cannon shell. They slammed into the reinforced concrete walls, burying themselves deep, leaving star-shaped impact craters. A large section of the turbine disc, a white-hot, spinning saw blade, ripped upwards, shearing through steel support beams and tearing a gaping hole in the roof before vanishing into the gray Soviet sky. The test shed filled instantly with thick, black, oily smoke and the smell of ozone and molten metal. The air hissed with escaping superheated air and fuel. An alarm klaxon began to wail, a futile, mournful sound against the fading echoes of the explosion. When the emergency crews finally doused the flames and the dust began to settle, the scene was one of utter devastation. The test stand was a twisted wreck. The engine was gone, replaced by a grotesque sculpture of torn metal. The floor was littered with glittering, razor-sharp debris. As the engineers surveyed the damage, their faces pale with shock and soot, the horrifying truth began to dawn on them. It wasn't a faulty bolt or a bad batch of fuel. The failure was fundamental. In their painstaking effort to copy the Nene, they had meticulously replicated its dimensions, its shapes, its assembly. But they had misunderstood the most basic design principles. They had copied the geometry of the turbine blades, but not the intricate internal cooling passages that kept them from melting. They had used a metal that looked similar, but lacked the complex crystalline structure that gave the British alloy its strength at high temperatures. They had replicated the engine's form, but not the deep, materials science soul that gave it life. It was the engineering equivalent of tracing a Rembrandt masterpiece but forgetting to mix the paints, using only mud and chalk. The outline was perfect, but the substance, the genius, was utterly absent. They had built a coffin and called it an engine. The silence in the aftermath of the explosion was more deafening than the blast itself. It was a silence of profound professional shame and creeping political fear. A report was drafted, couched in the opaque, blame-deflecting language of the Soviet bureaucracy, but the message to the Kremlin was clear. The project had failed. They could not build the Nene. The British engine, in their hands, was an unopenable black box. The options were bleak. They could continue to pour resources into a bottomless pit of failure, risking more disasters and the inevitable purge that would follow. Or, they could swallow a dose of humiliation so potent it threatened to choke the entire Soviet scientific establishment. Incredibly, they chose the latter. Through the most clandestine of backchannels, using cutouts and intelligence officers posing as trade officials, a secret message was passed to the British. It was not a public admission. There were no official notes verbal. It was a whisper in the dark, a plea from a rival who had been caught cheating and was now begging for the answers. The request was breathtaking in its audacity. The Soviets needed help. They needed replacement parts for the engines they had destroyed. They needed more engines, more parts, more samples of the magical British metal. The subtext of the message was clear, a stark admission of failure that must have burned in the sending. We tried to copy your engine and destroyed it. Can you send us more? In London, when the decoded message reached the desks of the Foreign Office and the Air Ministry, the reaction was not one of anger, but of stunned, almost pitying disbelief. They had expected espionage. They had expected a relentless, clandestine effort to steal the secrets they had so foolishly given away. They had prepared for a shadow war of spies and counterintelligence. They had not expected this. The Soviet Union, the self-proclaimed vanguard of the proletariat and the future of industrial science, reduced to asking for a resupply like a clumsy undergraduate who had broken his beaker in chemistry class. It was an embarrassment on a geopolitical scale. Yet, after the initial shock wore off, the British found themselves facing the same agonizing calculus that had led them to give away the engines in the first place. The Attlee government, still paralyzed by the fear of provoking a war, saw this as another opportunity to build bridges. Some even argued, with a perverse logic, that by helping the Soviets, they could exert a modicum of control over the situation. Furthermore, there was a certain smug, satisfying schadenfreude in the situation. The mighty USSR, for all its bluster, was coming to Britain, cap in hand. And so, in a move that defied all strategic logic, Britain said yes. Again, another shipment was prepared. This time, it contained not just complete engines, but crates of spare parts, turbine blades, compressor wheels, sets of bearings. It was a care package for a failing industrial rival. The Soviets, their pride in tatters but their pragmatism intact, accepted the shipment. And this time, with these new parts, with the ability to study undestroyed examples and reverse engineer components with more care, they finally got what they wanted. Using the British-made parts as a crutch, they managed to get the RD-45, and its more powerful derivative the VK-1, into mass production. It would power the MiG-15, the fearsome jet that would soon clash with American F-86 Sabres in the skies over Korea. The Soviets had their jet engine, but its origin story was not one of glorious socialist achievement, but of catastrophic failure and a humiliating plea for help, a secret shame buried deep beneath the roar of its stolen thunder. The arrival of the second shipment of Nene engines and spares was not met with the propagandistic fanfare of the first. This delivery was shrouded in secrecy and a profound sense of professional mortification. The crates were taken not to a showcase hangar, but to a closed, high-security laboratory, a place where failure could be dissected in private. The mood among the Soviet engineers was no longer one of triumphant acquisition, but of grim, determined analysis. They had been humbled by physics. Now, they had to conquer it. Armed with these pristine, undamaged examples, the teams at the Klimov Bureau and Allied Metallurgical Institutes began a forensic-level deconstruction of the British technology. This was no longer a simple exercise in copying dimensions. It was a deep, systematic investigation into the very soul of the machine. They used every tool at their disposal, from spectrographs to analyze the exact chemical composition of the alloys, to X-ray crystallography to understand the grain structure of the metals that gave them their strength. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to crack the formula. The secret wasn't a single, magical ingredient, but a symphony of subtle, interlocking technologies. Soviet metallurgists, brilliant in their own right but previously constrained by a lack of high-quality materials and precise specifications, now had a target. They worked furiously to improve their own steel and nickel superalloys, experimenting with vacuum arc remelting techniques to remove impurities and create a more homogeneous metal structure. They learned to add precise amounts of cobalt and titanium to the mix, elements that formed strengthening precipitates within the alloy, allowing it to resist the terrifying creep that caused turbine blades to stretch and warp under heat and centrifugal force. The reverse engineering of the internal cooling channels was a revelation. By painstakingly sectioning sacrificed British turbine blades, they uncovered the labyrinthine network of tiny, precise passages inside. This was not merely a design feature, it was the core of the blade's survival. They understood now that it was a system. A carefully managed flow of cooler air bled from the compressor that created a protective, insulating film over the blade's surface. Their earlier attempts had either ignored this or implemented it crudely. Now, they adapted their own investment casting processes, learning to create ceramic cores around which the molten metal could be poured, forming these life-giving internal passages. Crucially, they also began to adapt the design to Soviet manufacturing methods. They couldn't simply replicate the British production line. Their machine tools, while robust, lacked the finesse. So, they made compromises. Where the British used near-perfect, mirror-finish surfaces on compressor blades for optimal airflow, the Soviet versions were slightly rougher. They thickened some components by fractions of a millimeter to account for potential variances in their own metal quality. The result was an engine that was, in some respects, slightly heavier and marginally less efficient than the original Nene, but one that could be reliably produced in the thousands on Soviet factory floors. The final product of this agonizing, years-long process was the Klimov VK-1. It was a direct, undeniable descendant of the British Nene, a technological child born of both imitation and desperate innovation. It produced a respectable 5,950 pounds of thrust, a significant improvement over the original, proving that the Soviet engineers had, in the end, not only understood the lesson but had begun to build upon it. When this engine was mounted into the airframe of the new Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15, the result was a weapon that sent a shockwave through Western intelligence. With its swept wings, powerful cannon armament, and the thrust of the VK-1, the MiG-15 was a formidable interceptor. It could climb to altitude with breathtaking speed and outmaneuver most of its Western contemporaries. When it appeared in the skies over Korea in 1950, it instantly established air superiority, forcing the United States to rush its own newest fighter, the F-86 Sabre, into the theater. The irony was as profound as it was tragic. For years, American and British pilots would duel with, and be shot down by, an aircraft powered by the very heart of British engineering, a technology that had been handed to the adversary in a fit of misguided diplomacy. The West was spending blood and treasure to fight an enemy equipped, in part, with weapons they themselves had provided for free. The story of the Nene engine transfer remains a subject of intense historical debate, a Rorschach test for interpreting the early Cold War. In archives and academic journals, historians still argue over the true motives behind Britain's fateful decision. Was it sheer diplomatic pressure, a fear of saying no to a belligerent and unpredictable Stalin? Was it the political naivete of an exhausted government, desperate to believe in the possibility of peaceful coexistence even as the evidence of Soviet aggression mounted? Or was there a genuine, if tragically misplaced, desire to avoid a conflict that would have made the horrors of the Second World War seem trivial? The truth likely contains elements of all three, a perfect storm of hope, fear, and miscalculation that altered the balance of global power. But while the British decision is debated, the Soviet failure is remembered by those who study the history of technology for something far more ironic. The USSR, a nation that would become famous, and often successful, at copying foreign technology, from the B-29 that became the Tu-4 to countless examples of Western electronics, suffered one of its most profound and instructive humiliations when it tried to replicate an engine it didn't yet understand. The story exposes the critical difference between copying a blueprint and mastering a technology. It revealed that advanced engineering is not just about shapes and sizes, but about deep, systemic knowledge, the alchemy of metallurgy, the precision of machining, the physics of thermodynamics and fluid dynamics. The explosion in the test cell, the months of metallurgical disasters, the backdoor, hand-in-hand requests for more engines. These are episodes largely forgotten by the wider world, buried in declassified files and the memoirs of retired engineers. They are not the stuff of national myth, but for the engineers who were there, who watched their workshop turn into a fireworks show and felt the sting of professional inadequacy, it was a formative, searing experience. It was a brutal lesson that forced a leap in Soviet materials science and manufacturing, a painful but necessary education purchased with shattered metal and wounded pride. In the end, the jet engine that the USSR tried to copy, and failed, so spectacularly at first, did more than just power a fighter jet. It shaped the entire early Cold War. The MiG-15, born from that failure, defined aerial combat over Korea, influenced Western fighter design for a generation, and cemented the jet engine as the paramount symbol of military technological supremacy. The frantic Anglo-American efforts to counter the MiG accelerated their own jet programs, fueling the arms race that would define the next half-century. It was a catastrophic failure that became a decisive turning point. It taught the Soviets how to truly master a technology, not just mimic it. And it taught the West a bitter lesson about the naivete of gifting strategic secrets to an adversary. The roar of the VK-1 engine was not just the sound of a jet, it was the sound of a lesson learned the hard way, echoing across the frozen landscape of the Cold War.